Before there were names, before there was time, there was the quiet. It stretched endlessly, untouched by memory, untouched by loss. But something in the quiet longed to be more, an unnamed ache that shivered against the stillness, yearning to hum. And so the first sound was born, not a song but a fracture. It did not sing for beauty, it sang to know itself, though it knew it might break in the knowing. From that moment forward, nothing was ever whole again. The quiet machinery of souls. I woke to the sensation of unraveling, as though the fibers of my very being were fraying at the edges. No bed, no sky, just an expanse of endless dark, punctuated by a billion shifting points of light, each flickering like a dying memory. There was no weight, no breath, and when I tried to feel my body, there was nothing, only awareness suspended in a void where the rules of form no longer mattered. The lights around me pulsed like the heartbeat of some enormous, unseen thing. One flared suddenly, brilliant and golden, and in its glow I glimpsed something impossible. A fleeting image of myself at a crowded cafe, hands wrapped around a warm cup, laughter spilling from my lips. I should have been comforted by the familiarity, but instead, dread took root. The moment fractured like glass struck by a hammer. The cafe dissolved, replaced by shifting sands of noise and cold. I tried to call out, but what came was not a voice, only a tremor, a ripple in the void. My thoughts fragmented as the scene reassembled. Now I was somewhere else, standing beneath a vast sky, stained in hues of indigo and crimson, a burning horizon swallowing stars. The image felt distant yet intimate, as though I had stood there before. But hadn't I? I felt something stir beneath the surface of my thoughts, a whisper, ancient and nameless, threading itself through my mind. It wasn't a language in any human sense, but something older, primordial, its weight pressing into the marrow of my awareness. Who are you without what you remember? The question wasn't spoken. It bloomed within me like an answerless riddle. I reached into the void for a memory, any tether to who I was, and found only echoes. A face I knew but couldn't name, a name I whispered but couldn't claim. My mind began to stretch thin, unraveling like fabric worn too long against the tide. More lights flickered to life, each a miniature diorama. A hand brushing against another beneath lamplight, a mother lifting a child to the sky, a soldier's final scream as fire bloomed around them. None of them belonged to me, or perhaps they all did. I was everywhere and nowhere, a mosaic of half-formed histories. Then the lights began to blink out. One by one, they were swallowed by a tide of formless dark, as though the cosmos itself had grown tired of pretense. In their absence came the hum, the low seismic resonance of something vast shifting in the silence. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, pressing into every fractal thought that remained. The void itself trembled. That's when I saw them. 1,000 versions of myself flickering in and out of focus like failing lanterns. Some bore familiar features, others had faces too foreign to comprehend, features twisted by time and ruin. They reached for me with eyes that glimmered with fear. I mirrored their gestures, though I didn't know who had moved first. "You've always been here." The voice was mine. Or it had once been. It came from every direction and none. The last light in the void shattered, casting the world into complete nothingness. Only then did I understand the truth. I wasn't being pulled into oblivion. I was the oblivion. Then, from within the abyss, something whispered, soft and vast, endless and terrible. "Come." I was drifting, or perhaps falling. Movement had lost meaning in the absence of distance. All around me, the void churned like smoke caught in an unseen current. From the swirling darkness, shapes began to emerge, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and clarity. Mirrors. Endless panes of glass formed an ocean beneath me, their surfaces shifting as if alive. Each one was a window into some impossible reflection. I leaned closer, if such a thing as closer existed, and saw a version of myself staring back. He was younger, eyes bright with ambition. He reached out, his hand trembling as though he recognized me. But when our fingers nearly met, his face melted into a kaleidoscope of color, distorting into a grin that wasn't mine. The sea of reflections rippled, and new faces emerged, some familiar, others alien. I saw myself older, gaunt and hollow-eyed, watching the world through a haze of regret. Another reflection. I was standing atop a hill as ash rained from a crimson sky, my hands clutching something fragile and broken. My heart surged with recognition, but the memory slipped away like water through my fingers. I wanted to scream, to demand answers from the glass, but the reflections didn't listen. They only stared, their eyes brimming with quiet, unbearable truths. A whisper echoed through the abyss, barely audible. There is no single you. Suddenly, the ocean surged. Waves of mirrors collided, shattering into shards that hung in the air like stars. I saw myself in each fragment, a child lost in a crowd, a wanderer beneath unfamiliar constellations, an old man staring at the edge of his last breath. None of them spoke, but their silence pressed into me like gravity. Am I all of them? I thought. Or maybe I spoke. I no longer knew the difference. The abyss answered with another ripple, and from the shards a single reflection began to take form. It was me, yet not me. The face in the glass was serene, too serene. I felt something ancient in that gaze, something that had seen lifetimes come and go like fading embers. The reflection smiled, a quiet curve of lips that spoke of knowing. "You've forgotten because you wanted to," it whispered. The words struck me like a blow. I reached for the reflection, desperate for understanding. The surface of the mirror shifted beneath my hand, cold as ice but yielding like water. As my fingers pressed through, I felt it, something vast and endless, waiting on the other side. The reflection dissolved, but its whisper lingered. "You've been here before." Then the mirror rippled and burst, sending waves of light cascading across the abyss. The fragments scattered, forming a constellation of memories that I could not grasp. The sea beneath me vanished, replaced by silence so complete that I felt it hum within my very bones. I was alone again, or perhaps I had never been alone. In the distance, a shape began to form, glowing faintly like a distant star. The hum grew louder, resonating with something deep within me. "Come," the voice called again, soft and terrible. I didn't know if I was ready, but I had no choice. I drifted toward the light, and the abyss swallowed the last of the mirrors. The light pulsed in the distance, rhythmic and deliberate, like the beacon of a dying star. It expanded and contracted, drawing me closer with each cycle, though I could not tell whether I was moving or it was reaching toward me. The hum that filled the void grew louder, no longer a single tone, but a layered chorus of harmonies. Each note resonated with something fundamental within me, plucking at invisible strings tied to my very existence. It was not a song meant for comfort. It was a dirge, a requiem for the self. As I drew near, shapes flickered within the light. At first I thought they were shadows, but they were too precise, too deliberate in their form. They swirled and danced in arcs, weaving intricate shifting patterns, like smoke given purpose. They weren't bodies. They were impressions of motion, fragments of something greater than the shapes they formed. They sang without mouths, and their melody bypassed thought and language, sinking straight into my mind. I could feel the meaning behind their song, and it struck me like cold iron. You are unraveling. I tried to speak, to ask them who they were, but my words dissolved before they formed. A memory surfaced, brief and fleeting. I was in a crowded room, a hand resting in mine. I turned to see her face, someone important, someone real, but her features blurred and melted away like smoke caught in a wind. The song swelled again, and the memory was gone. Pain lanced through me, not physical, but something deeper, a severing. I became aware of the process unfolding within me, the slow dismantling of everything I was. My sense of time, place, and self frayed at the edges, peeling away like ash from a burning log. The song guided the process like a surgeon's blade, precise and methodical. The shapes moved closer, orbiting me like planets caught in a gravitational pull. One broke away from the rest, spiraling inward until its form was a blur of gold and shadow. Its presence was suffocating in its enormity. When it spoke, the hum of the song shifted, its tone almost mournful. You were not meant to remember. The words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of inevitability. Remember what? I thought, or tried to. My question felt like a futile echo in the vastness of the void. The shape's glow dimmed, and for the briefest moment I saw something familiar. A figure clad in forgotten colors, reaching out to me across a distance of ages. It felt like remembering the sensation of warmth without recalling fire. The others began to sing again, their song more urgent now, more insistent. The void vibrated with their chorus, and I felt the final threads of my being begin to unravel. I clung desperately to the last pieces of what I thought was me, but what was I holding on to? Was there ever a self to preserve? Or was it a mask crafted to make sense of the chaos? The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through my mind until I thought I would break apart completely. And then silence. The shapes stopped their motion. The hum cut off, leaving behind an unbearable emptiness. In that silence, I heard something new. A voice, singular, soft, and ancient. Come. There was no force behind the word, no command, only a beckoning. I drifted toward the point where the light converged into a single point of impossible brightness. It pulsed once, slow and mournful, before splitting apart into a doorway of nothingness. I hesitated, knowing that I stood at the threshold of something final. Behind me there was only the void, the unraveling remnants of a story I could no longer understand. Ahead of me lay the unknown. The voice spoke again, almost kind now. It's time. With what remained of my will, I stepped forward, and the void swallowed me whole. The vast rib cage of the dead colossus arched high above me, its ivory arcs stretching toward a horizon drenched in amber light. The judges loomed at the center of this graveyard of stars, their forms writhing in contradiction, vast yet intimate, grotesque yet beautiful in their unknowable symmetry. The hum of their presence reverberated through my mind like a terrible hymn. The one of many mouths stepped forward, its myriad jaws whispering, chattering, devouring the silence. As it spoke, its overlapping voices created an unbearable harmony, half speech, half dissonance. Who were you, truly? The question wasn't a question at all. It was an excavation. I felt it burrow deep, unearthing fragments of moments I had long forgotten, or had chosen to forget. A vision flared in my mind, a cold morning, frost on the window pane, her silhouette framed in pale sunlight. I remembered the way her fingers grazed mine, the fleeting warmth of that small gesture, but the moment was severed before I could hold on to it. "Why did you let her slip away?" the judges intoned, their chorus unified for the first time. I staggered beneath the weight of the question, as though the entire cosmos leaned against me. My thoughts twisted in on themselves, searching for meaning in the shadows of my own regrets. The truth was simple but unbearable. I was afraid. The spherical judge of countless eyes blinked in slow succession, its iris-rimmed orbs shimmering with cold recognition. The answer I had whispered to myself seemed to amuse it, or perhaps disappoint it. The eyes shifted and reformed until they became her eyes, familiar, filled with unspoken questions. The monumental judge with the cracked stone face remained silent, though I felt its presence press against my chest like the weight of a final confession. If your fear defined you, is it your failure or your essence? The mouths laughed, not with malice but with a hollow, pitiless amusement. I felt the laughter bloom inside me, curling like smoke in my lungs. "What does it matter?" I rasped, though I knew they could hear my thoughts without sound. My voice, even in this place, felt too human, small, fragile. Everyone is shaped by their fears. What else could I have done? The spherical judge's eyes swirled again, their shapes morphing into endless possibilities. I saw myself in other lives, one where I spoke the words I had been too afraid to say, another where I chose the unknown over the safety of solitude. I saw versions of myself that were fearless, and versions so consumed by terror that they became hollow imitations of a person. "Do you believe you were ever free?" The cracked monument finally spoke, its voice like stone breaking beneath glaciers. The question hit me harder than the others. I had always believed that my choices, my silence, my hesitations were mine. But in the face of the judge's gaze, that belief crumbled. The memories they showed me were like scripts, pre-written by some distant playwright. Had I ever acted of my own will, or had I simply followed the pull of the unseen strings that made up my fears and desires? "You speak of fear as if it absolves you," the judges said as one, their voices weaving together into a perfect, awful harmony. "But fear is not a verdict, it is a door. You chose whether to walk through it or to close it forever." I clenched my fists, though I had no hands. I could feel myself unraveling beneath their judgment. My memories were no longer solid. They were blurred, stitched together by fragile threads. And yet, the warmth of her hand still lingered somewhere deep inside me, a pulse of light in a sea of shadows. "I was afraid," I whispered, "but I loved her. Doesn't that mean something?" The mouths curled into a grotesque, knowing smile. The eyes blinked in unison, unfazed by the plea. The stone judge remained motionless, but I felt the answer before they spoke it aloud. "Love is not an anchor, it is an echo." Their verdict rang through the chamber. My vision blurred, and for a moment I saw her again. Not as a memory, but as something more real than anything else in this hollow, starless place. I reached out, desperate to hold on. "She was never yours to hold," they said, "only yours to remember." I felt my spirit shatter beneath the truth. The judge's chorus swelled, and the ribcage of worlds trembled as their forms dissolved into spirals of stardust. Their final words hung in the void like the last toll of a bell. "You are sentenced not by your actions, but by your potential." The sentence burned through me, a searing brand. The fabric of reality began to tear, and the void beyond it yawned wide. I screamed, not from fear, but from the sudden, terrible understanding of what they meant. My choices had been possibilities, and my failures had echoed across lives I would never live. I was being judged not for what I had done, but for what I had never dared to become. The last thing I saw was her face, her lips moving in a silent plea that I could not hear. Then the abyss reached up and swallowed me whole. I was falling, though the concept of direction had long since unraveled. The rib cage of stars fractured around me, each bone snapping into fragments of light that spiraled into the void. I drifted among the ruins of creation itself, waiting for the impact that never came. In the distance, the judges' forms reassembled, vast and shimmering like a celestial tribunal. The spherical judge blinked its eyes in slow succession, once, twice, 1,000 times, until the act became the rhythm of the void itself. Its gaze bore down on me, and I felt the weight of uncountable timelines pressing into my skull. To see all doors is to know none. The sentence hung in the void, incomprehensible yet absolute. Below me, doors flickered into existence. Thousands, maybe millions, each a rectangle of flickering light, suspended midair like the teeth of some vast cosmic maw. The frames quivered, their thresholds unstable, as if struggling to decide whether to open or collapse. "This is your burden," the judge of many mouths said, its voices overlapping like waves against jagged stone. "To walk where all paths meet and none can be followed." My mind flared with anger, a futile rebellion against the vast indifference of their judgment. I didn't ask for this. The words echoed through the void, brittle and small. The stone-faced judge, silent until now, shifted for the first time. Cracks spidered across its monument-like form as if it had withstood millennia of truth without ever speaking. When it finally spoke, the void itself bowed beneath its words. "No one asks to be born." The doors shimmered and pulsed, each threshold humming with its own distant song. I caught fleeting glimpses of the worlds beyond, one bathed in golden sunlight where laughter echoed in the air, another filled with obsidian cities and the silent procession of forgotten gods. There were countless possibilities, too many to comprehend, each as alien as the next. The spherical judge's eyes spun again, and for a moment they became mirrors. I saw myself reflected in every pair, living, dying, lost, triumphant. Some versions of me were noble, others monstrous. I saw lifetimes of solitude and unity, failure and triumph. But beneath every reflection was a singular truth. No life was free from suffering. "You are sentenced to witness eternity without understanding it," the judges said in unison. The void beneath me began to ripple like the surface of some vast cosmic lake. Each wave revealed another set of doors, spreading outward until they formed an infinite lattice, stretching into the unseen distance. "Choose," the voices commanded. A wave of nausea struck me. How could I choose when every path felt like a trap, every door a lie? I reached for the nearest frame, a glowing aperture that flickered with images of warmth and stillness. For a brief moment I felt the presence of someone familiar. Her laughter rang out, faint but clear, like the sound of bells over an empty field. "No," I whispered, withdrawing my hand. I knew this was a lie, a memory draped in soft fabric to hide the razor beneath. The judges watched without pity, their forms pulsing with the cold hum of inevitability. "There is no perfect life," I muttered. "Is that what you want me to see? That no matter what I choose, I will suffer?" The mouths twisted into something resembling a smile. The eyes blinked with cruel amusement. The stone judge's face remained impassive, though I felt its silence resonate louder than any answer. "We do not punish," they said as one. "We reveal." The truth struck like a hammer. The verdict wasn't absurd because it was cruel. It was absurd because it was undeniable. Every choice I had made in life had been a reach towards something unknown, a blind step through a door whose consequences I couldn't predict. And now, at the end of all things, the same truth remained. I would always be searching, always choosing, always failing to know where the path would lead. My chest felt hollow, a space once filled by something fragile that I could no longer name. The endless lattice of doors shimmered, daring me to move. The void whispered, "Which one will you walk through?" The judges began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into constellations of dust and shadow. "Wait!" I shouted, reaching toward them. But they were already gone, their sentence branded into the fabric of my being. I turned back to the doors, each pulsed with the light of 1,000 forgotten suns, their songs overlapping until they became one deafening note. "Which door?" I whispered to myself, though the answer was always the same, none of them and all of them. The hum returned, soft now, almost kind. The void yawned wide and I stepped forward. The frame shimmered as I passed through, my form dissolving into light, and as the abyss consumed me, I understood. The path had never mattered, only the step. The void folded inward, compressing until it became something tangible, a lattice of doors stretching out in all directions, suspended in the dark like stars frozen mid-collapse. Each frame pulsed faintly with its own breath of light, and the hum that had followed me through every threshold returned, deeper now, steady as a drumbeat. No two doors were the same. Some were wrapped in vines that shimmered with frost, others bound by molten gold. A few were little more than jagged frames of bone and iron, blackened with soot. I drifted forward, though I could not say whether I moved or if the lattice itself shifted to meet me. The hum pressed against my thoughts like the weight of something unspeakably old, something indifferent to whether I moved or stayed. I reached the first door, a simple frame of wood, chipped and worn, as though it had endured lifetimes without purpose. The surface shimmered, and as I drew closer, a scene bled through. A quiet home atop a hill, its windows glowing with soft amber light. I saw shadows pass behind the glass, two figures seated together, their movements gentle and slow. A memory stirred, not sharp but familiar, like a name whispered through water. Her laughter. The warmth of it made my chest tighten. I reached out without thinking, desperate for something I couldn't name. But as my fingertips brushed the surface, the image twisted. The hill withered into ash. The house crumbled, and the shadows inside became hollow. The warmth turned to a bitter chill. I pulled my hand away. The hum pulsed again, but softer now, as though it pitied me. The lattice swayed, the doors around me flickering with faint light, each one a silent invitation. They waited, not patiently, but inevitably. The next door called to me. Its frame was made of polished stone, cold and gray, its edges lined with fractures. It reminded me of an epitaph too old to be read. The surface rippled, revealing a vast city stretching beneath the sky the color of tarnished silver. I saw towers carved from bone and stone, their spires spiraling toward a horizon stained with dying stars. I stepped through. The air was thick, metallic, almost alive. I stood on the edge of a crumbling balcony, overlooking streets that pulsed with dim, rhythmic light. But there was no life here. The city was vast and empty, its towers hollowed by time. In the distance, shadows flickered like dying embers. They were human shapes, almost, but too slow, too still. They moved like memories caught in a loop, repeating gestures that no longer had meaning. One of them paused, raising its hand towards something unseen. I felt a weight settle in my chest, the quiet ache of recognition without understanding. I called out, though I didn't know why. The sound fractured and died before it reached the streets below. A whisper stirred at the edges of my thoughts. Is there any difference between living without purpose and ceasing to live altogether? The shadows turned, their faces obscured, and for a moment I felt their gaze, a silent accusation or a plea. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the door was behind me. The city dissolved into smoke, the shadows vanishing into the void. Back in the lattice, the hum trembled with a low, mournful resonance. More doors glimmered in the distance, each frame aglow with potential futures or endless regrets. I felt them calling, and in their call, I felt the weight of a truth I had avoided. I was searching not for her, but for the version of myself I had lost when she slipped away. The lattice waited, unconcerned with whether I stayed or stepped forward. It would wait forever if it had to, but I couldn't. With a final breathless thought, I reached for the next door. The next door was forged from something unfamiliar, neither metal nor stone, but something smooth and pale, like the bones of a creature too large to comprehend. Its frame pulsed faintly, emitting a soft, rhythmic glow that matched the hum in the air. I reached out, and the surface rippled like liquid glass. As I stepped through, the void peeled away, and I fell, not through space, but through something deeper, a current that carried the weight of forgotten centuries. I landed on cold, black earth. The air shimmered with an artificial stillness, as though it had been crafted rather than born. Above me, the sky stretched vast and empty, the color of a dying ember. 3 suns hung motionless, casting faint, pallid light that didn't quite reach the ground. The landscape was alien, a vast expanse of stone and glass, sculpted into strange, spiraling shapes. Monolithic towers rose from the horizon, dark and seamless, their edges too sharp to be natural. They hummed faintly, and I felt their vibrations in my bones. Rivers of pale blue light ran through the ground like veins, pulsing in time with the hum. At first, I thought I was alone, but then I saw them, shapes drifting in the distance, almost human but thinner, elongated. They moved without urgency, their forms shifting as though they were made of smoke. I walked toward them, though each step felt heavier than the last. I reached the base of the nearest tower and placed a hand against its surface. It was smooth, cold, and alive with energy. The hum intensified, and an image flickered across its surface, brief but unmistakable. A face. Her face. I staggered back as the image dissolved, replaced by a ripple of light. One of the figures drifted closer. It didn't walk. It flowed like a shadow in slow motion. Its face was blank, featureless, like smooth stone shaped into a rough outline of what it had once been. It raised a hand, though whether in greeting or warning, I couldn't tell. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure tilted its head as though weighing the question. Then a thought bloomed within me. Not words, but something older, carved into the marrow of existence itself. "We were once like you." The figure's form rippled, as if struggling to maintain its shape. More figures emerged from the shadows, each one a fragment of something greater, something that had fallen apart over untold centuries. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and sky. I felt it resonate within me deeper than sound, like the slow disintegration of meaning itself. The tower flickered again, and I saw another memory. Not mine, but theirs. I saw what they had been, beings who once held the keys to creation itself. They had traveled beyond the boundaries of time and form, reshaping the cosmos in their image. But they had ventured too far, dissolved too deeply into the infinite. "You became everything," I whispered, understanding dawning too late. "And in doing so, you became nothing." The figures drifted closer, their blank faces shimmering with faint luminescence. They were beautiful in their emptiness, a monument to potential unbound by limits. Yet there was no joy in what they had become, only stillness. One of them raised a hand toward me, not in menace, but in offering. I hesitated. "You seek her," the thought pressed into me. "But she is not here. She never was." The weight of the truth settled over me like ash. I had stepped through the door hoping for answers, for some fragile remnant of what I had lost. But I had found only another kind of oblivion, one shaped not by loss, but by endless becoming. The tower behind me cracked, its surface splitting like glass under strain. The ground shuddered, and the figures began to dissolve into streams of pale light, their forms unraveling in slow, mournful spirals. "Is this what waits for all of us?" I asked, though there was no one left to answer. The tower's hum reached a final crescendo, and the world itself began to collapse inward. The sky fractured, and the rivers of light dimmed until only darkness remained. I stumbled back into the lattice, my form trembling as though it had been scraped hollow. The lattice pulsed faintly, the doors shimmering with exhausted light. I felt no urgency to move, no compulsion to press forward. "She's not behind any of these doors," I whispered. The thought tasted bitter but true. The lattice pulsed again, as though it had always known that truth. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, the next door was already waiting. The next door drifted toward me, slow and deliberate. Its frame was made of dark obsidian, fractured with jagged veins of green light that pulsed in slow, shallow breaths. The hum from the lattice was quieter now, almost hesitant, as though it didn't want me to pass through. I reached out and pressed my hand against the surface. It felt cold, colder than anything I'd ever known, and for a moment I thought I'd been turned to stone. Then the door opened, and the void swallowed me whole. I woke beneath twin suns. The sky was burnt gold and scarred with shifting clouds that writhed like wounded things. A forest of spires rose in the distance, gray, sharp, and crooked, reaching upward like broken fingers. The ground beneath my feet was cracked and dry, a patchwork of jagged obsidian plates that shimmered with faint green veins. The wind moaned across the landscape, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. Despite the vastness of the place, the horizon felt close, as if the world had folded in on itself. Something moved in the distance, a slow, lumbering shape that left a deep, glowing trail in its wake. I watched as the creature dragged itself across the scorched earth, its body covered in a shell of stone-like plates. It had no eyes, only ridges of smooth bone where a face might have been. For a long time it did nothing but breathe, long, slow exhalations that made the ground tremble. I felt a strange kind of kinship with the creature. We were both wandering through a landscape that didn't belong to us. I began to walk toward it. The creature didn't react as I drew closer. Its breaths were rhythmic, almost soothing. When I reached its side, I saw that its body was scarred with deep fissures, each one glowing with the same pale green light that ran through the ground. There was something familiar in its shape, though I didn't know why. "What are you?" I whispered, though the words felt useless. Its breathing slowed, and for a moment I thought it might respond, but it didn't speak. Instead, its body began to split apart along the glowing seams. I stepped back as the plates of stone peeled away like petals from a dying flower. Beneath the shell was something soft and pale, something human-shaped. It was her. She lay curled at the center of the broken creature, her skin luminescent beneath the twin suns. Her hair drifted in an unseen current, weightless and delicate. She looked as though she'd been sleeping for centuries. I reached out, afraid she would crumble beneath my touch. Her eyes opened. "Why do you keep looking for me?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was no warmth in it. "Because you're all I have left," I said. Her expression softened, but there was something distant in her gaze, as though I was little more than a dream she had woken from. "You've always known the truth," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "I'm not what you're looking for." The ground trembled beneath us, and the sky began to darken. The twin suns dimmed until they were little more than distant embers. "Then why do I still feel you?" I asked, my voice cracking. She reached out and placed her hand over my chest. Her touch was soft but unrelenting, and I felt the weight of all I had lost press against me like a stone. "Because you made me part of you," she said, "but that doesn't mean I'm real." Her form began to dissolve, her edges blurring into pale light. I tried to hold on, but she slipped through my fingers, scattering into fragments of fading luminescence. "Don't leave me," I whispered, though I already knew she was gone. The landscape around me cracked and shattered. The spires in the distance collapsed into dust, and the air itself began to unravel. The creature's hollow shell crumbled into fragments, and I stood alone beneath the dying sky. The hum of the lattice returned, low and mournful. The world fell away, and I drifted back into the void. I emerged in the lattice of doors, the endless expanse of frames pulsing faintly. I felt weightless, hollowed out. The hum surrounded me, waiting. Another door shimmered in the distance. I closed my eyes and let the hum carry me forward. The next door drifted toward me as though it had been waiting all along. Its frame was simple, bare and unadorned wood, worn smooth as though shaped by time rather than by hands. There was no glow, no pulse of strange energy, only the faint scent of rain-soaked earth emanating from its surface. I hesitated. This door felt different. The hum of the lattice, ever present in its quiet insistence, had faded into silence. I reached out, pressing my hand against the door. It gave way beneath my touch, and I stepped through. I stood in a room that could have been anywhere or nowhere at all. The walls were rough stone, covered in cracks that leaked pale light. A simple wooden table stood at the center of the room, and atop it lay something small and familiar, a fragment of polished glass. Its edges shimmered with faint iridescence, like a sliver of a star fallen to earth. I picked it up, and the room shifted. In the reflection, I saw not my face, but something else, flickering images of all that I had been and could have been. They came in flashes: a boy running barefoot beneath a summer sky, a lover tracing quiet promises into my skin, a stranger standing at the edge of a nameless city, watching shadows rise from the sea. But beneath them all was a constant, a single moment that repeated, like the refrain of a forgotten song. Her hand in mine, slipping away. I stared into the fragment, and for the first time I understood. I had carried that moment with me across every threshold, every unraveling world. It had become the axis of my being, shaping everything I had sought, everything I had feared. "You gave too much of yourself away," a voice said behind me, soft, familiar, yet distant. I turned, and she was there, standing in the doorway, her form bathed in a faint, shifting light. But she wasn't the same. There was no sorrow in her eyes, no longing, only a quiet understanding. "I had to," I whispered. "It was the only way to keep you with me." She stepped forward, her bare feet brushing against the stone as if she barely existed at all. She placed her hand over mine, the fragment of glass pressed between us. "You thought that love was holding on," she said, "but it was letting go." Her words broke something in me, something deeper than regret, deeper than grief. I had come here searching for a way to fill the hollow place inside me, but I hadn't realized that the hollow was all that remained. I looked down at the fragment. Its surface no longer shimmered. It was dark now, ordinary, fragile, nothing more than glass. "What happens if I let it go?" I asked. Her gaze softened. "You find yourself..." I held the fragment for a long moment, the weight of its smallness unbearable. Then, with trembling fingers, I set it down on the table. The room shifted again. The cracks in the walls deepened, spilling streams of pale light until the room itself began to dissolve. She took a step back, fading with it, her form turning to dust and starlight. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She smiled, not with sorrow, but with something close to peace. "You don't have to be." The room collapsed around me, and I was falling again, through stone, through stars, through memory. The lattice of doors reassembled itself, flickering into existence as I drifted back into the void. The hum returned, softer now, almost reverent. I opened my eyes and felt something I hadn't before. A lightness, a faint breath of something unnamed but familiar. I looked at the doors around me. They pulsed in slow succession, but their urgency was gone. They no longer felt like demands, only possibilities. The hum didn't press me forward, it simply waited. I took a step, not because I was searching, but because I could. The lattice dissolved around me, folding in on itself like the last breath of a dying star. In its place, something else emerged, an expanse too vast to comprehend, its edges stretching beyond sight and reason. I drifted toward its center, carried by a pull I could neither name nor resist. The hum returned, but now it was different. Deeper, layered, as though it came from the beating heart of the cosmos itself. And there it was, the core mechanism. It wasn't a machine in any sense I could understand, though it pulsed with rhythm and precision. Its form was paradox-made flesh, searing light and shadow intertwined, countless spinning gears shaped from the bones of forgotten constellations. They turned slowly, grinding out the threads of existence, their motion deliberate and eternal. Between the gears, streams of something not quite liquid and not quite light coursed through unseen channels, each thread carrying the birth of a world or the death of a soul. The air, if it was air, shivered with the weight of it all. The hum wasn't just sound, it was the echo of countless lives being spun into and out of existence. "This is where all things are made," the thought pressed into me, unbidden and unmade. I drifted closer until I saw them, figures hunched within the mechanisms, indistinguishable from the machine itself. Their forms were brittle, blackened things, hollow-eyed and silent. They toiled without pause, adjusting the great cogs, feeding the streams of light into the core. I knew without needing to be told what they were. Souls that had surrendered everything they were in service to the machine. One of them turned toward me. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for faint cracks that leaked a pale, sickly glow. I felt something cold bloom in my chest. Recognition. It was me, or it had once been. Do you understand? The hum pressed deeper now, curling around my thoughts. No, I whispered, though my voice felt weightless. What is this place? The figure raised its hand, and the gears behind it slowed, their grinding shifting to something mournful. The hum softened, though it was no comfort. This is the engine of permanence. All that you have lived and all that you will become is forged here. I stared at the gears as they turned. Some spun smoothly, weaving seamless strands of light that vanished into the abyss. Others cracked and shuddered, spilling malformed threads that broke apart as soon as they were made. Why do some break? I asked. The figure hesitated, or perhaps it was the machine itself that paused. Then the answer came, low and raw. Because some lives cannot bear the weight of being. The gears nearest me slowed further, revealing glimpses of worlds caught mid-creation. I saw forests of glass that sang when the wind passed through them. I saw beings made of ash, kneeling beneath skies filled with molten rain. I saw myself, alive, alone, unmade in countless ways. Each version struggled, twisted by a fate not of its choosing. This is suffering, I muttered. The hum grew louder, but this time there was something cold beneath it. Existence is weight. There is no thread that does not fray. The figure stepped back into the core, its outline fading until it was no longer distinguishable from the machine. The gears resumed their motion, grinding out new beginnings and endless endings. A new voice, quiet but ancient, whispered from the core itself. Why do you still resist? I shuddered. It wasn't a challenge, it was a plea. I saw in that moment what the mechanism wanted, for me to stop struggling, to accept my place as another cog in the endless machine, to dissolve, to end. I clenched my fists, though I had no form to hold. What happens if I refuse? The hum slowed. The lights dimmed. And for the first time I sensed fear in the vastness. The core mechanism spoke again, this time not in thought but in sound. A voice so vast it seemed to shake the bones of existence itself. You will break. A memory rose unbidden, the warmth of her hand, the way it had slipped from mine. It had defined me, anchored me. But here in the shadow of the machine, I understood the horror of that anchor. To live was to bind oneself to something transient, knowing it would one day slip away. That was the weight of being, not the fear of death, but the certainty of loss. But there was another truth hidden beneath that terror. If I lose myself to avoid pain, was I ever alive at all? The hum faltered, as though the question had pierced something deep within the mechanism. The gears shuddered, and for a brief moment I saw a glimpse of something beyond the machinery, an expanse without structure, without meaning. A void, not of death, but of freedom. The voice from the core trembled. To step outside is to unmake everything you were. It is oblivion without return. I took a step forward. The mechanism screamed, an unholy sound that reverberated through the lattice of reality. The figures embedded within it writhed, their shapes flickering like dying stars. I pressed my hand against the core's surface, feeling the heat of countless lifetimes burning beneath my touch. I am more than this, I said, though the words barely reached my own ears. The hum shattered, the great machine faltering. The gears slowed, caught between momentum and collapse. Light spilled from the core, fracturing into 1,000 paths. I felt it pouring through me, searing and cold, unraveling everything I had been. "This is your last chance," the core whispered, though its power was fading. "Surrender, or be nothing." I closed my eyes. I thought of her. The warmth, the loss, the pain, the joy. The pieces of me I had tried so hard to hold on to. "Maybe being nothing is the only way to truly be free," I whispered. I pushed forward and the machine began to break. The machine howled, a sound like dying suns collapsing inward, folding space and time into themselves. The gears, once so deliberate and perfect in their turning, began to tremble and grind, their momentum thrown into chaos. The threads of existence, those rivers of light and life, spilled in every direction, shimmering and fragile. But the machine wasn't dead, not yet. From the shadows beneath the spinning cogs, they came. They emerged slowly as though torn from the substance of the void itself. Long, hollow forms made of ash and starlight. Their faces were indistinct, masks of smooth darkness that hinted at forgotten features. Their hands, skeletal and thin, moved with precise, unnatural grace. I counted hundreds, maybe thousands, but Ayo knew there were far more. They had always been here, hidden behind the hum, unseen gears of the great mechanism. One of them drifted toward me, its form crackling with faint light. Its voice did not echo in the air, but within me. "Why?" The question was small but vast. It wasn't accusing, it was bewildered, almost sorrowful. "Why resist what you were made to be?" The others began to surround me, their forms weaving like smoke. I could feel their curiosity, their quiet pity. Each one was a soul that had surrendered everything, identity, memory, self, for the promise of peace. They had become the machine, and the machine had become them. I took a step back, but there was nowhere to retreat. Their collective hum pressed in from all sides, thick and stifling. I felt their truth burrow into me. It is easier to be nothing than to be something. One of them raised a hand, and I saw what it had been before. Fragments of a life flickering like a dying candle. It had once been someone with a name, a home, a heartbeat. It had once held someone's hand beneath a sky filled with stars. But all of that was gone now, burned away by the weight of eternity. "You wanted to escape pain," I whispered, the realization sinking in. "So you gave yourselves to this." The worker's hand dropped, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of sadness in the emptiness where its eyes should have been. "We did not know we would forget ourselves." The words were soft, like the last breath of a fading memory. "And you still choose to stay?" I asked, my voice rising. I couldn't understand how anyone, anything, could cling to such a hollow existence. The workers shifted, their forms flickering. One of them answered, though I couldn't tell which. "It is better than breaking." My pulse, or whatever was left of it, pounded in my ears. The machine behind them groaned, straining beneath the cracks spreading through its core. I could feel its agony, its desperation to repair itself. "You think you're free because you've become a cog in something bigger," I said, the words trembling but fierce. "But what kind of freedom is that?" The workers remained silent. I stepped forward, pushing past them, their forms trailing behind me like smoke. Each step felt heavier, as if I was sinking into the weight of their resignation. One of them, smaller and thinner than the others, reached out and grabbed my arm. Its touch was light but cold enough to burn. "Do you think you're different?" it asked, its voice quiet but piercing. "Do you think your rebellion makes you free? You're still bound to your grief, to your need for meaning. You cling to suffering as tightly as we cling to stillness." The truth of its words struck deep. I had carried my pain like a banner, worn my grief like armor. What was I without it? Without the memory of her hand slipping from mine, without the weight of loss that had defined me for so long. But as the hum surged around me, I knew something the workers had forgotten. The weight of suffering didn't make existence unbearable, it made it real. "You gave up everything to forget," I said, "but I don't want to forget, even if it hurts." The worker's grip loosened. Its form wavered, becoming transparent, as though I had struck something fragile within it. The others began to flicker too, their shadows unraveling into pale wisps. The hum that bound them together faltered, splitting into uneven echoes. For the first time, I heard silence between the notes. The machine shuddered as the workers dissolved into ash, their final whispers fading like dying embers. I watched as they scattered, carried by invisible currents back into the void. The gears slowed, the streams of light thinned, their currents fraying like forgotten melodies. At the center of it all, the core pulsed weakly, its glow dim and ragged. It spoke one final time, its voice faint and desperate. "Without them, I cannot turn." I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached toward the collapsing core. Its heat no longer seared. It felt cold now, like a fire reduced to embers. "Then maybe you were never meant to turn." The light in the core flickered, sputtering like a flame starved of oxygen. For the first time since I had entered this place, I felt the hum begin to die. The hum was gone. The silence it left behind was immense, stretching endlessly in every direction like a freshly hollowed grave. The great gears no longer turned. The rivers of light that had once poured through the core of existence were now faint threads, flickering as if they too longed to unravel. I drifted toward the core, its shattered form dim and unsteady. It looked smaller now, stripped of its grandeur, a pulsing fragment of something ancient and fragile. Where before it had sung with the force of creation itself, it now emitted a soundless plea, trembling beneath the weight of its own collapse. As I reached out, a voice rose, not from the core, but from within me. "Will you rebuild it?" The question lingered like a splinter in my thoughts. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of that choice press down on me. If I rebuilt the machine, the gears would turn once more. The hum would return, soothing and steady. Lives would be spun from the void, their beginnings and endings neatly woven into the great lattice of fate. But I knew the truth now. I had seen the souls that powered the machine, their shapes hollow and worn down by stillness. I had seen what remained of them after they surrendered their pain, their joy, their meaning, all to escape the terror of breaking. To rebuild it was to accept that same fate, to let the hum drown out the chaos of existence in the name of order, to choose comfort over freedom. But what was the alternative? The void shifted around me, vast and hungry. If I destroyed the machine completely, if I let the last fragments of it crumble into dust, there would be nothing left to shape the threads of existence. No more birth, no more memory, no more time. A figure emerged from the shadows, a reflection of myself, though its edges flickered like a dying flame. Its eyes were dark, voids that pulled everything inward. "Without the machine, you'll drift," it said. "You'll become lost, forgotten. Is that what you want?" "I don't know," I whispered, though the words felt brittle. "I'm tired of being a prisoner." The reflection tilted its head, expressionless. "Then what will you be?" The weight of the question settled into me. Without the hum, without the machine, there would be no structure, only the raw, endless unknown. "What if there's nothing after this?" I asked. "What if the void is all there is?" The reflection's gaze didn't waver. "Then you'll finally be free." I turned back to the core. It pulsed weakly, as if struggling to hold on to what little light it had left. I reached out and placed my hand against its surface. Memories flooded through me, not mine, but the memories of the machine itself. I saw it being built by something vast and unknowable. I saw worlds bloom and die beneath its watchful hum. I saw how the first souls had offered themselves to it, not out of fear, but out of love. A love so profound that they had chosen to become the architects of everything that followed. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," I whispered. "It wasn't supposed to be a prison." The core trembled beneath my touch, its light flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. I felt its exhaustion, its desperation to continue turning even as it unraveled. "I'm sorry," I said, though I didn't know whether I was speaking to it or to myself. I closed my hand into a fist. The core flared in response, its light surging as if trying to fight back. But it was too late. With a final, deliberate motion, I crushed it. The light shattered. The hum collapsed into silence so deep that it felt like the breath of the void itself. The core dissolved in my hand, its fragments drifting away like ashes caught in a nameless wind. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no shape, no thought. Just the vastness of the void stretching out forever. Then, slowly, I began to feel something else. A pulse. Not the hum of the machine, but something smaller, quieter, a heartbeat my own. I was still here. The void began to shift, its darkness no longer oppressive, but vast and open. There were no doors, no lattice, only the expanse of possibility stretching out in every direction. For the first time, there was no voice telling me where to go, no hum guiding my steps. "What now?" I asked aloud, though there was no one left to answer. The answer didn't come in words. It came in the stillness of the void, in the quiet pulse of my own being. Anything. The void stretched out in all directions, vast and soundless. There was no lattice, no machine, no hum. Only an expanse of empty potential. The silence wasn't hollow, though. It was alive, dense with something unseen. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking infinity, with nothing tethering me to the ground. I drifted forward, or perhaps I stayed still, and the void moved around me. Time felt irrelevant, like a word that had lost its meaning. And yet, the pulse within me remained steady, soft and persistent. For the first time, I was truly alone. At first, the realization was a relief. The hum was gone, and so were the whispers of fate. But in the absence of everything, a cold thought took shape. If there is no purpose, no path, then what am I? The silence answered with more silence. I felt the urge to create something, anything, just to fill the space. My thoughts spiraled, reaching for memories like anchors in the abyss. Her face came to me again, not sharp, not vivid, but blurred, like a painting smeared by time. I reached for her, but she was just another fragment slipping away. "Is this it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes." The thought wasn't despairing. It was simple, almost gentle. This was all there was. No grand revelation, no celestial voice, just the quiet certainty that I was free to build or to drift. In the distance, I saw something faint, A flicker of light, small and fragile, like the ember of a candle clinging to life. I moved toward it, though the distance felt endless. As I drew closer, I saw it wasn't a flame or a star. It was a fragment of glass, the same one I had set down in the room of memories. It hung in the void, suspended and untouchable, reflecting nothing but its own quiet shimmer. I stared at it, the pulse in my chest growing louder. It wasn't a remnant of her or of the machine. It was something else entirely, something I had left behind when I stepped through that final threshold. It was me. I reached out not to hold it, but to see it clearly. The surface was unremarkable, a simple piece of glass, fractured along its edges. But as I stared, I saw something that I hadn't noticed before. The cracks formed a pattern, spiraling outward like a map without borders. "What does it mean?" I whispered, though I knew the answer didn't exist in language. It didn't need to. The fragment pulsed softly, in time with my heartbeat. I understood finally that it was never about knowing what lay beyond. It was about accepting that I didn't need to know. The cracks in the glass weren't flaws. They were where the light had entered. I let my hand fall away. The glass remained suspended, but its glow began to fade. Slowly, the void around it began to shift, not into something vast or terrifying, but into stillness. The kind of stillness that felt more real than anything I'd ever known. A thought whispered through me, unbidden but undeniable. You can create something new, or you can simply be. For the first time, the choice was mine. I stood in the silence, the weight of all I'd lost no longer a burden, but a part of me, like the quiet hum of a heartbeat that had endured everything. The void wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, and it stretched out in every direction, endless and unnamed. I took a step forward. The void didn't move, but it felt as though it breathed, a slow, soundless exhalation of everything that had ever been. I stood in its center, though there was no center. There was only the quiet hum of my heartbeat, a fragile rhythm against the vastness. The light from the glass fragment I had left behind was gone. The hum of the machine was gone. All that remained was the silence. A new doorway began to form, slow and unsteady, as if unsure whether it should exist. It wasn't made of bone or light or stone. It was nothing more than an outline barely visible, a suggestion of passage. It led nowhere and everywhere at once. I stared at it, my thoughts unraveling and knotting back together. This was the end. No more doors after this. No more searching. And yet, what if they were right? The thought coiled around my mind like smoke. What if the machine was right? The gears had turned for a reason, hadn't they? They spun to keep everything in place, to shape existence into something coherent, something that could be named and understood. Without it, everything was unknowable. A vast sea with no stars to navigate by. I felt my breath, real or imagined, catch in my chest. What if stepping forward wasn't freedom? What if it was oblivion, not as an end to suffering, but as an end to being? The silence deepened, folding over me like a weightless shroud. A voice stirred within me. Not the hum of the machine, but something smaller. My own voice. Do you need to be anything at all? The question was neither cruel nor kind. It was bare, a flicker of light against the darkness. And with it came another memory. Not of loss, not of her hand slipping from mine, but of the smallest moment. Sunlight through an open window, dust motes drifting like stars in slow orbit. I wasn't thinking of her, I was thinking of me. That moment hadn't carried meaning because it was destined or grand. It was simply real. And in that small, unremarkable truth, I had been. I turned to face the doorway of nothingness, my pulse steady but soft. The void began to hum again, not like the machine, but softer, like a distant echo of a song that had never been sung. A thought pulsed within me, raw and trembling. What will you be without the weight of all you've carried? The question felt like a blade cutting away every defense I had built. Without my grief, my fear, and my search for meaning, what would be left of me? Was I defined only by what I had lost, or by the fact that I had dared to carry it? I felt a swell of doubt, sharp and cold. What if I stepped forward and vanished completely? What if there was no peace, no revelation, only the dissolution of thought and memory? No echoes, no after, just stillness. The void didn't answer, it waited. I thought of the workers who had given themselves to the machine. They had feared this silence. I felt their terror in every crack and hum of that ancient mechanism. The fear of becoming something so vast that they would lose their shape, their names. But what if they had it backward? What if I wasn't unmaking myself by stepping forward? What if I was becoming something more than a thread caught in a wheel? Another memory surfaced, unbidden. A quiet moment beneath an open sky, the sound of distant waves, her laughter carried on the wind. But this time it wasn't an anchor. It didn't hold me in place. It simply drifted past, weightless and free. I stepped toward the doorway, my form trembling with both fear and quiet joy. The void pulsed, soft and infinite, as though it was watching, not to judge, but to see what I would choose. I reached the threshold and paused. The silence was vast, but it didn't pull. It invited. For the first time I smiled, small, unsteady, but real. Maybe freedom isn't something you find, I whispered. Maybe it's what you make. And with that, I stepped forward. The void enveloped me, but there was no falling, no tearing apart. There was only stillness. I didn't dissolve. I didn't unravel. I simply was, not bound, not lost, just being. The hum was gone. The silence remained. And somewhere in that silence, something new began. The silence didn't end. I felt no ground beneath me, no gravity pulling me down or holding me in place. I wasn't drifting, I simply existed. There was no hum, no gears, no voice within or without. I was alone with the question I had carried across lifetimes. What now? I waited for fear to find me. It didn't. The void was open, vast, and starless. For the first time, I understood its simplicity. The weight of every choice, every tether was gone. I felt as though I'd shed a second skin, something I'd worn so long I'd forgotten it wasn't me, but the absence of weight was unsettling. Is this it? My voice was small, but it didn't tremble. The words hung in the airless space, unanswered. For a moment I longed for the hum, not because I wanted to return, but because the hum had always given shape to the unknown. Now, without it, the unknown stretched out infinitely. Am I truly free? I whispered. In the distance, though distance had no meaning here, something shimmered. A faint thread of light twisting and turning like a thread caught in the breath of the void. It wasn't a path, not in any physical sense, but a reminder. Continuity. I knew what it was, even before I reached for it. It was the door back, the continuation of the pattern. The hum could return. The gears could turn again. Life could be shaped, beginnings and endings woven back into place. My form would be given definition once more. Her laughter might return. For a long moment I stared at that thread. It pulsed softly, neither pleading nor commanding, just existing as a possibility. I felt the weight creeping back into my thoughts. What if the machine wasn't just a cage? It had shaped lives. It had kept things from falling apart into oblivion. Couldn't that be enough? The void around me pressed in, not with malice, but with the quiet reminder of choice. You can be whole again, the thread seemed to whisper. You can belong. I reached out, my hand inches from its glow. I felt a pull, not forceful, but familiar. I could let the gears turn once more. I could take my place in the hum and give myself to the calm rhythm of something larger than myself. I closed my hand into a fist and pulled away. No! The thread shuddered, its glow dimming before unraveling into nothing. I felt the void sigh, not in disappointment, but in release. I wasn't going back. The silence remained, endless and patient. There was no direction, no path forward, but that was the point. For the first time, I didn't need someone or something to guide me. I let go of everything, even the need for meaning, and something shifted. The void began to pulse, not with sound, but with life. Stars bloomed in the distance, small and faint at first, then bursting into brilliance. Colors that had never existed before rippled across the vastness. Nebulae spun like cosmic gardens, their shapes fluid and wild. I took a step, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see what came next. My form was no longer static. I could feel myself changing with every moment. I wasn't bound by memory or expectation. I was something else. No longer an echo of loss, but a beginning. In the midst of the unfolding creation, I heard something faint, a sound so soft it could have been a dream. Laughter. Not hers, not mine, just laughter. The sound of something new being born in the silence. The void wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, and so was I. The void pulsed one final time, soft and slow, like the breath of something infinite as it drifted into sleep. The stars I had seen, the colors, the spiraling gardens of light, they shimmered and faded, folding themselves back into the stillness. The laughter was gone too, a distant echo that left only silence in its wake. I stood at the edge of everything, no longer waiting for the void to give me meaning. I was the meaning now, unspoken, undefined. The vastness around me stretched endlessly, not as a prison, but as possibility. And yet, for all its openness, the question remained. Is this what it means to be free? The void didn't answer. It never had to. I closed my eyes, not to shut anything out, but to feel everything more fully. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of being forgotten, not of dissolving. And yet, somewhere in the quiet, a thought whispered, "Will anyone remember me?" The thought wasn't bitter, just soft, small, and very human. In that moment, I felt the pulse of something, a flicker, faint as the last ember of a dying fire. Not a command, not a call, just a ripple, a vibration moving outward into the endless dark. And I understood. We are remembered not by permanence, but by the way we change the silence around us. We are not echoes. We are the ones who make the void hum. I took one last step, and everything dissolved. The stars, the void, the pulse within me, all unraveling into threads of light that drifted away into the unseen. I didn't feel myself vanish.